15, verse 8 and verse 9. And you'll notice about Jesus Christ. So let's read, starting with verse 8.
Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, For this cause I will confess to thee among the Gentiles, and sing unto thy name.
Okay, let's pray. Father, we just thank you for what you'll show us tonight. We know that everything in your word is an encouragement and help to us. And we pray that you would show us some things here in your word that would just be practical in our life. And it would help us to understand Jesus Christ and why he came and all that he did for us. And we ask in Jesus' name, amen. And you may be seated. And we come to a verse in Romans that is not particularly for the Gentile. And I've got all kinds of notes. I'm not sure how deep we can go in this. A lot of us know a lot of things about what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. And there are some things that he has done for Israel, or came to do for Israel, and we're not Israel. And so we sort of brush it off, and we don't really look at that. And so we see here in Romans chapter 15 what Jesus came to do for Israel. And he's called the circumcision here. Look at Romans 15 verse 8. It says, Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister. Not every minister is, like we all think, a pastor of a church, but he was a minister. Minister is someone that serves, someone that comes to serve. And so he was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God. That the circumcision, we'll look at that word, what that means. That is basically Israel. I want to show you how we know that from the scripture. There's a few ways. Because in verse 9 he says, and that the Gentiles. And that the Gentiles. So what we have in verse 8 is for Israel. And Israel, the Jews. Paul often called the Jews and Gentiles. And so verse 8 is what Jesus came to do for the Jews. But then he says in verse 9, because Paul is an apostle to the Gentile, there's something he came to do for the Gentile. Now, like I said, we're going to start off by looking at verse 8. I don't want you just kind of brush it off or turn me off just because this is for the Jew. But I want to teach some things as well. Because there are two kinds of Jews. There's two kinds of circumcision. And there's two kinds of Israel. And if you don't rightly divide, if you think there's only one kind, rightly dividing sees two. It divides these things into two. But if you mush them into one, you're going to be in some confusion. And you're going to be, basically, you're going to be doing things that God never intended you to do. So let's look at that. I said there's two kinds of circumcision, two kinds of Jews, and two kinds of Israel. Now let's look at what he's saying here in verse 8 is physical. Okay, if I could put it simply, now this isn't in the textbooks. This is just how I put it. There are two of them. One I would say I call physical, and it's in the flesh. And the other is spiritual, and that's in the spirit. And so we have Jew, Israel, and circumcision over here in a spiritual way, but we also have it in a physical way. And good way to determine, we always, when we read the scriptures, and we're going to teach some things about also how to learn the scriptures. And so one of the things we always do is start off in the physical. Assume that it's dealing with the physical. Most of the Old Testament is dealing really with the physical. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are mainly in the physical. Even Acts is a lot in the physical. The Acts of the Apostles. So the Acts, something we can see, what they did, sort of, even though they... So a lot of the things that, especially Matthew, but a lot of the Gospels, I guess John would be more in the spiritual. There's a lot of spiritual things in there. But even Matthew, a lot of Matthew is talking about the Jew or Israel, or the circumcision, it's talking about physical Israel. So we would assume this would be physical. Verse number 8, it says, "Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God." So first thing we're going to do is we're going to assume, well, that's the circumcision. Okay, where does that come from? Well, it started there in Genesis chapter 17. Okay, so I'm going to be doing some teaching, not as much preaching to start with. And this is just to clarify and understand. It's very important. There is something out there, and you might have heard the expression that, that Israel in the Old Testament has now become the church. And so there's no Israel anymore. Now it's spiritual, but not physical. And that really changes things, especially when you look at future events. The Bible teaches that there's still going to be a physical Israel. There are promises to physical Israel. And Romans chapter, that verse we read in Romans 15 verse 8, talk about the promises. Those are promises to the physical Israel. Some call it national Israel. Israel that's in the flesh. We could say blood Israel. Israel that's Israel by birth, by blood. Okay, all those expressions. And where did it start with? It started with Abraham. Genesis chapter 17. And I'm going to put some things together. Maybe at the end it'll all sort of fit together. But Genesis chapter 17, verse number 1, "And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me, and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee." Okay, so, here's the thing. To physical Israel, we'll see how this unfolds, but to physical Israel, God made a covenant. So when you think of covenant to Israel, that is for physical Israel. That is not for spiritual Israel. And so what was the covenant? What was it? It was an agreement. And here's what God would do. And he says, "And will multiply thee exceedingly." Now, if you think this is spiritual Israel, as in a Christian, you think, well, what's going on here? What's wrong? Why aren't we having lots, why don't we have a large number of Christians compared to non-Christians? Well, you get mixed up with physical Israel and spiritual Israel. This is not for spiritual Israel. This is a promise, this covenant is for Abraham and his seed. Verse number 4, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee." And in the King James Bible, we know thee has to do with one person. Thee is Abram. "And thou shalt be a father of many nations." That word father. Father and the fathers, we're going to see that word tonight has to do with physical Israel. Okay? So keep some of these words in mind. Covenant, fathers, Abram's seed, Israel in the flesh, blood, all those refer to over, I guess I had it over here, on this side, the physical Israel. And the promise is to them that they will be exceedingly multiplied. There's something else there were some other things there. Verse 6, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of these. So that's how we get national Israel. That's where some people talk about Israel as a nation. Israel as a nation is over on the physical side. It's not on the spiritual side. Christian is not a Christian of a nation, you know. So that's where we get that part. National Israel or nation of Israel. And then it says in verse 7, I will establish my covenant, there's that word covenant, between me and thee and thy seed after thee and their generations for an everlasting covenant. So this means it will not end. Everlasting means, we know everlasting life, but it will not end. So if physical Israel ends, God has broken his promise. It's not going to end. Some people believe that national, physical Israel, the nation, all that kind of, that they're done. God is finished with them. This says, no, it's an everlasting covenant. And verse 8, very important verse 8, and I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land. I want you to notice that. You want you to mark that. The land. The land, and I'm always thinking physical Israel. I might have to switch over here to physical. I don't know why. My left side seems to be focused on physical. So the physical Israel is promised a land. Very important. So we got covenant, we got Abraham, his seed, we got multiplying the seed, we've got a land. What is that land? Tells us where that land is. Verse 8, and all wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. That means physical Israel will possess the land of Canaan, and that's everlasting. Okay? Okay, so that is physical Israel. That's what Paul is talking about, because now we get to the circumcision part. Verse 9. Now we're building up to something. I know that this Old Testament is not very interesting. Okay, you're going to learn something, I hope. We're going to learn something, and that is there's a physical Israel and there's a spiritual Israel. And there are promises to physical Israel. That's what Paul is talking about. Okay, go back. Let's interact. Let's go back to Romans, but we're going to keep going here in Genesis. But just go back, and so we're going to see some things. Some things we already saw in Genesis 17. Let's go back to Romans 15, verse 8. We'll look at some things here. This is why Jesus came to earth. This is what Paul is saying. Here's why Jesus has purposed to come to earth. Verse 8, now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision. Now we're going to get to that just shortly in Genesis. For the truth of God, to confirm the promises. We just already looked at some promises. One was the multiplying of the nation. The second one was that they would be in the land of Canaan. So those are some promises to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. Abraham was the first father. He was the first father of the covenant of the circumcision. See, we talked about the circumcision. Abram, and now let's go back to Genesis. He's the first father of the circumcised. Nobody else was circumcised before Abraham. Nobody else. Nobody had this covenant that was given to Abraham, and the covenant that was part of that covenant being the circumcision. So let's keep reading. Verse number 10. Verse number 10. This is my covenant. God is speaking to Abraham. Which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Now that seed there, thy seed after thee, is physical Israel. That's, we say, by blood. Seed means the children. And the children and the children's and the children. And we state Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were the first fathers. Abraham being the first father. Because this is the first time circumcision comes up in the Bible, and the first time it's used as a covenant. It's part of the covenant. So what is it? Okay, let's keep reading. Verse 10. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. And then it explains a little bit about it. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And it will be on the 8th day. Verse 12. And he's born in your house. Verse 13. Explains it keeps on going down. But the circumcision, now this is a physical circumcision. And it's only for men. The women didn't have to do this. Only the men. Say, why just the men? Well, I can give you some ideas, but we won't go into that. But the men were to be circumcised. So that was, do you see what the word is there? It's a token. Verse 11. It's a token of the circumcision. So this circumcision, this is talking about physical circumcision. You got a physical knife, and you cut in a physical way. You cut the flesh. It's the flesh. And that's what Paul is speaking about in Romans chapter 15, verse 8. When he talks about circumcision, he's talking about those in the flesh. Israel in the flesh. Jesus came to earth. First, his one goal to first of all, and I know that Gentile wasn't mine, but the Gentile wasn't his first priority. His first priority was to come to Israel. That which was the circumcision. He didn't have to come to the Gentiles. He did. We got in on it. We'll look at that, but he came for his own. John chapter 1, verse 11. He came for his own, and his own received him not. And then God said, and as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. If Israel will not receive my son, God says, I'll give it to the Gentile. And that's exactly what we read in the book of Matthew. Okay. So now I'm going to just go to explanation. We'll go in Galatians chapter 2. Some of this might sort of puzzle pieces, and they're kind of all scattered, but I hope at the end they'll all sort of come together and you'll see the picture. And we're really looking at physical Israel and spiritual Israel. But they're also called Jew, and they're also called circumcision. All three terms are used in a physical way and also in a spiritual way. I don't know if we'll have time to look at all the verses of all three. So we got 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. There's verses for everyone. Okay, let's go to Galatians chapter 2. Now, what's our first rule of interpretation? We have two things, one being physical, one being spiritual. What do we assume first? We always assume it's physical. always assume it's physical first. And you read for clues, you read for, a clue word for physical is flesh. In the flesh or something like that. But you always assume it's, first of all, it's physical. Okay, let's go to Galatians chapter 2. We're just going to define, I want you to see how there's physical circumcision and uncircumcision, but they're related to Jew and Gentile. The circumcision is the Jew. When God says circumcise, the circumcision, what he's saying is that's the Jew. And when he says this uncircumcision, that's the Gentile. Now, some of you know this, but this is for some that don't. These are just definitions. Galatians chapter 2, and they'll help you. They'll help you as you read your Bible. It says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 7, contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, that's Paul's talking here, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. So Peter has, so what do? We have to think it's physical. So Paul went to the uncircumcised by birth. People that did not come under the covenant of the circumcision, people that were not of Israel, he said, I'm going to them. And Peter, he's going to go to the circumcision, which is of the covenant of Abraham. And Abraham, there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob means what? His name is also Israel. Okay, so think of the fathers. The fathers are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or we could say Abraham, Isaac, Israel. Israel is one of the covenant fathers. But we're going to find out they're also called Jews. Okay, and then it says in verse 8, and he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same is mighty in me toward the Gentiles. Now if you look at verse 7 and 8, it's kind of clear that the uncircumcision have to be the Gentile. Verse 7 he said, I'm going to the uncircumcision. And verse 8 he says, I'm going toward the Gentile. Okay? So that's pretty clear. The uncircumcision, and this is the uncircumcision in the physical side, they are the Gentiles. Well, what's the uncircumcision? Wouldn't they be the Jews? Well, look at verse 14. And you can put two and two together and you find out in verse 14 it says, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, remember, Jesus came for the truth. I said unto Peter before them all, if thou be a Jew, see, Peter was a Jew, and he went to the Jews, the circumcision. If you being a Jew liveth after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Now, what Paul is saying, now all I'm saying here in this verse, we got Jew, Gentile, Jew, Gentile. Over back there in verse 7 and 8, it's uncircumcision of circumcision. Okay, what's going on here? He's really talking about the same. Uncircumcision is the Gentile. Circumcision is the Jew. And Paul is saying, now we're back to Romans 15, our verse is saying that Jesus Christ was a minister to the circumcision, to the Jews. Physical Jews, those that were born as a Jew. That's where he went first. Jesus was a Jew. Okay, so now let's look at how Jesus' ministry and his ministry to the Jews. Matthew chapter 1. Let's start in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. Because what are we going to find in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1? Abraham. He's in there. Why? Because Jesus Christ came out of Abraham. That's why Matthew has it there. Matthew 1 verse 1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. It's exactly what Paul said, Romans 15. Remember, we're trying to study Romans 15:8. And there Paul said it's Jesus Christ. He uses the same term. It says the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why does he say the son of Abraham? Because Abraham was of the covenant. Abraham was of the circumcision. Abraham was one of the fathers. And the fathers were Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And so he keeps, in verse 2, he starts with Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob. But Jacob was Israel. Now, why does he start with Abraham? Why doesn't he go all the way back to Adam? Why not all the way back to Adam? Because the emphasis is that Jesus came out of Abraham. The emphasis is not that he was a man coming out of Adam. The emphasis is that he was of the seed of Abraham with the circumcision. Jesus did get circumcised. Okay? And we see that in Luke chapter 2, that his mother went and got him, and he was circumcised. And he was under the covenant. And he was a Jew. He is also an Israelite. Okay, now let's look at that. I'm saying circumcision, Jew, and Israel, they're all the same. Now, I have heard this, and it sort of confused me a little bit. I heard that the Jews are only people from Judah. That's why they're called Jews. The Bible doesn't express that. A Jew in the New Testament, and I'm not going to go through all the verses. If you want to come and see me, I've got all kinds of them on my desk. I was studying this the other day a little more, and I don't have time to go through. I'll look at some of that. But don't let people say, well, the Jew is only those from the tribe of Judah. I'll show you. It's not. A Jew is someone from Israel. Paul said he was a Jew in the book of Acts. And then in the book of Romans 9 and verse 11, he said, I'm an Israelite. 1 Corinthians, he says, I'm an Israelite. Or 2 Corinthians. Okay, but let's see it in Matthew. So, Jesus Christ came, and this is what Paul is saying. This is what Paul is saying in our verse. That Jesus Christ came as a minister to the circumcision, to Israel, to the Jews. That's physical. And so that's why Matthew starts this way with Abraham. That's where Paul is getting this. First of all, we start in our Bible, and we call it the Old Testament and New Testament. The New Testament, technically, it started when the blood was shed on the cross. But in our Bible, we have a title, New Testament, and we start in Matthew. How does Matthew start? It starts with Jesus Christ, but it starts by showing he was of the son of David and the son of Abraham. Why Abraham? Because he's the seed of Abraham. He's of the circumcision. He's part of the covenant. He came for his own, and his own received him not. Why David? Because he's going to be a king. Because he's going to be a king. And that's how it starts. Now, let's go to Matthew chapter 2. And don't be afraid, well, are we going through the whole book of Matthew? No, we're not going to go through the whole book of Matthew. But I want to show you some things. Okay, Matthew chapter 2 shows us that Jews and Israel are the same. And it says there, that he was, this is where the wise men come. And he's born in Bethlehem of Judea, in verse number 1. And verse number 2, and these wise men come, and they're saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? That's why Matthew started with the son of David, because he was going to be a king. And Abraham, because he is going to be of the Jews. You see that? King, David, king, Abraham, Jews, king of the Jews. That's what they're looking for. And they're, everybody's troubled. Here it's troubled. And verse number 4, and when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes and people together, demanded of them where Christ should be born. Christ is the special deliverer, the special Messiah, the special anointed one for Israel. And they're all looking for Israel, and they're wanting to know where he would be born. And they found out in the scriptures that he's going to be born in Bethlehem, verse 5. But verse 6, and thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Okay, that's true, Judah. You would say Judah, Jew. Okay, well, let's keep reading. Art not the least among the princes of Judah, but for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Now in verse number 2, he was king of the Jews. What does a king do? Does a king not rule? Sure, a king rules. And what does he say he's going to rule? In verse 6, he's going to rule my people, God's people, Israel. That is a loaded phrase there, because some people don't believe that Israel is God's people anymore. Well, it's just the Christians are God's people. No, Israel, physical Israel, is still God's people. They still have an everlasting covenant. They're just kind of put away, on the side for now, but they're still in God's program. He's still going to come back to them. But notice, King of the Jews, and he will rule my people Israel. That's why I say Israel and Jew really are the same. They're interchangeable. It's not just Judah. It's Israel. All of Israel. All of Israel. And it's not just, and some people will say, well, Israel were done away with, a long time ago. Israel's name was changed to Jew. Well, no, Paul uses the word Israelite in his writings. In Matthew, he talks about Israel. All the way through, Israel and Jew, Israel and Jew. Okay, now let's go to his ministry. Now we all know Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is, we call it the Sermon on the Mount. And that's a great sermon, and we need to study it, we need to abide by it, and follow it. But when we look at the order of things, we find that the Sermon on the Mount was only given to the Jews. How do we know that? Well, let's keep going. So the Sermon on the Mount is done in Matthew chapter 7. Then we get Jesus healed the centurion in Capernaum, and go to Matthew chapter 10. Well, some of you know this, but Matthew chapter 10 and verse number 5. And Jesus chooses his disciples. And verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He says, don't go the way of the Gentiles, but go to the house of Israel. We see how Gentiles and Israel are different. Even the Samaritans are sort of a mix. He says, don't even go there. Now, in the book of Acts, God says, all right, you'll be endued with power on high. The Holy Spirit will come upon you. And then you should go first to Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then unto the uttermost part, right? So that changes in Acts. But right now, right now, soon after the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, don't go in the way of the Gentiles. That's why we can assume that when he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he wasn't preaching to the Gentiles yet. Yeah. Now there are some turning points. One person thinks, most people think the turning point in the book of Matthew is Matthew 12, verse 14. Matthew 12, verse 14, where it says, then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, against Jesus, how they might destroy him. And then right after that, the next verse 15 to 21, look at verse number 18. He quotes out of the Old Testament. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show judgment to the Gentiles. Okay, so now here in Matthew we see this sense where, well, the Gentiles are in mind now. But what happened? The Pharisees, who were the leaders of Israel, said, they rejected him. We're going to kill him. And there's something about that. Now, you can think about it, meditate about it, but it's interesting that as soon as the Pharisees take counsel to destroy Jesus, Jesus starts talking about the Gentiles. And Romans chapter 15, verse 8, about the circumcision Israel, Jews. But then Paul says, yeah, there's something for the Gentile too. Jesus came for the Gentile as well. Now when Peter preaches, now we're going to skip all the way to the book of Acts. I already quoted in Acts 1 verse 8, where Jesus was telling his disciples now, you don't have to just go to Judea. You don't have to just go to Jerusalem. You need to go also to Samaria. Okay, so he's changing things, and even into the uttermost part of the earth. When Peter preaches his first message, he starts at Jerusalem. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, look at Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 is interesting. Verse number 5, I want to show you this. Acts chapter 2, verse 5. This is the day of Pentecost, we call it. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews. You notice that? He's talking about Jews. Devout men of every nation under heaven. So these were Jews that had gone to other places. And that's where they spoke in tongues, and they could hear, everybody could hear in their own language. Verse 7, and they were all amazed and marveled, saying, behold, are not all these that speak Galileans? And how hear we, every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born? So these were Jews that obviously were scattered into all kinds of places. They were born there. They learned the language of that place, and you can read all the places there. But they were called Jews. Okay? Remember how God was going to punish Israel by scattering them. One of the things, and here's another thing, remember the promise? The promise to Israel is the land. One of the other part of that promise is to be gathered into the land of Canaan. That is the promise to Israel. You know what the Israel thinks as a punishment? The worst thing that you could do to Israel is scatter them so that they're not in the land. That just undoes the promise. To us, the worst thing you could do, for a Gentile, it could be is not that, but worst thing. I don't know what the worst thing of a Gentile, take away their house, burn their house down or something. But the worst thing you can do to an Israelite is send them out, scatter them out of the land. And so that's what happened, but these are all called Jews. They're all called Jews. But notice what Peter, he stands up in verse 14, he says, "Ye men of Judah, and all ye that dwell at Jerusalem, they were there for a feast day." But look what he calls in verse 22, "Ye men of Israel." These that were Jews, scattered abroad, not in their land, they were scattered abroad. And what does Peter call them? He calls you a man of Israel. You don't say, "You Jews," it says, "Ye men of Israel." And you can do a little study. Many of the messages in the book of Acts, whether it's Paul or Peter, they go to the synagogue, and who's going to be in the synagogue? The Jews. And you do the study. You can look at Acts chapter 13 and 9 in different places. But a lot of the times that Peter or Paul, see, Paul went first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. They would always say, "Men of Israel." I should say always, but a lot of times they'll address them as "Ye men of Israel." They don't say, "You Jews." They're called Israelites. They're men of Israel. Look at chapter 3, verse 12. You see it in there? "Ye men of Israel." Ye men of Israel. And this is a very important, this really ties in to Romans, the verse that we're on. Romans 15, verse 8. Here, Peter is speaking to the men of Israel, and these are men of Israel in the flesh. How do we know they're in the flesh? Well, the way he talks to them, they can't be spiritual, because it says in verse 14. Well, we'll look at verse 13. It says, "The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob." Why did he say that? He's reminding them of their fathers, the fathers of Israel, and the God that they served. And it says in verse 14, "But ye denied the Holy One and the just, and desired a murder to be granted unto you, and killed the Prince of Life, whom God has raised from the dead, whereof we are witnesses." That is not spiritual Israel, folks. That rejects Jesus Christ, kills him, and puts him to death. That was physical Israel. And when Peter is saying, "Ye men of Israel," he's speaking to physical Israel. Those that were born as Israelites. Also called Jews. But he tells them, "Ye are men of Israel." But here's the thing, verse 25. Here's where it ties in to Romans chapter 15, verse 8. And you can compare that. So if you have Romans 15, verse 8 still, you'll see some similarity. It says, verse 25. Okay, it goes through all these different things. We're just going to look at verse 25. "Ye are the children of the prophets." Who is that? Physical Israel. "And of the covenant which God made with our fathers." Do you see that? Romans 15, verse 8. You see the word? Confirm the promises made unto the fathers. The promises were part of the covenant. Okay. What were the promises? Well, that they would be multiplied, that they would get in their land. Okay, those were some of the promises. But Paul is thinking about the promise that they would get a Savior. That one of their kind would come and die for their sins and bear the burden of their sins. And really, that's one of the promises, the main promise that Paul is getting. See, an Israelite, their main thought is get in the land, be prosperous in the land, be blessed with lots of children, multiply, be a powerful nation. And that's in their mind, that's in their thinking. But the most important thing for them is salvation. is forgiveness of sins. And this is where Peter is going to mention that. Let's keep going in Acts chapter 3. To get to the good part here. In Acts 3 verse 25. Ye are the children of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with our fathers. Remember? Paul mentioned the fathers. The promise to the fathers, saying unto Abraham. Why Abraham? Abraham, in our mind, you think circumcision. He is the first to be circumcised. Okay, that's what Paul. So we're really very similar to what Paul is saying. And in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. Okay? How are they going to be blessed? Verse 26. Here it is. Unto you first. See that word first? This is the first thing that was on Jesus' mind when he came. Unto you first God, having raised up his son Jesus, sent him to bless you. And what's an Israelite thinking? Oh, I'm going to have lots of children. We're going to be in the land. That's what they think is their blessing. But Peter just stuns them. He just wipes out all those thoughts of in the land and multiply and blessing. Says, here's how he really blessed you in turning, verse 26, in turning away every one of you from his iniquities. And when they heard that, you can imagine they were just blown up. What? That's why he came? That's the blessing? Because an Israelite, a physical Israelite, would always, he wants, and I forgot about the promise of the king. He wants to be in the land. He wants to have a king that rules with a rod of iron and just rules in perfect justice. And they're in the land, and they're multiplied, and that's their blessing. But they missed that Jesus came down the cross for their sin. They missed it. And so here's what Peter's saying. You killed, you murdered the one that was coming here to bless you. But even in murdering him, he gave them a blessing. Because he couldn't have forgiven their sins and turned away from their sin without dying on the cross. What a plan of God and all what God can do. And when they believe in Jesus Christ, and instead of thinking about multiplying and in the land and having a king, and they start thinking about Jesus, first of all, see that word first, when they first think that Jesus came to die on the cross for their sins, to take away their iniquity, turn them away, turn them to righteousness, that's when they stop being physical Israel, and now they're spiritual Israel. See? Now they're Israel in a spiritual way. They're still born Israel. They're still in their blood. But now they have something else. Something really important. Forgiveness of sins and a Savior that lives inside them. And he abides in them, and it's the abiding life of Christ. And that's what Peter's wanting them to get. He wants them to get. This is the best blessing that you could ever get from this Jesus Christ. Now, one day you will get in the land. One day Jesus Christ will reign in the land, and he'll reign over you perfect justice. That will happen. Revelation chapter 20, that will happen. Revelation 19, though, he's going to have to come and destroy all the nations. And even before that, God's going to punish Israel and scatter them. They might be in their land now, but God's going to scatter them again. Just before the end, he's going to scatter them and just say, I'm in control here. I'm in control. You got to turn to me. But you see, in all of this, some of the Israelites turned to the Lord Jesus, but not all of them. And if you continue to read in the book of Acts, Paul would go first to the Jews, and there's 2-3 times where the Jews just rejected him, One of those times is Acts chapter 13. Now let's actually go there. Acts chapter 13. I'm saying what Paul is writing in Romans chapter 15, verse 8. He's saying, here's what Jesus came to do. And it was to minister to the Israel, to minister to the circumcision, and to minister them salvation, the promise of salvation from their sin. The other promises, they're going to come later. But this one is what he really came for first of all. Acts chapter 13. Now, this is typical of what Paul did at the beginning of his ministry, of his missionary journeys. Verse 14, you read, I want to skim there and see where he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Why does he go there? So that's where the Jews are. He's going to the Jew first. And then after reading the law, verse 15, and look at verse 16. Then Paul stood up and beckoning him with his hand. And you know how he dressed it? Just like Peter. Men of Israel. He didn't stand up, okay, you Jews. And there's no Israel anymore. We don't use that term anymore. You Jews. No, he doesn't say that. He says, ye men of Israel. And he preaches to them. And he preaches Christ. And he preaches the promise in verse 23 of this man's seed, and he's talking about David, hath God according to his promise. Paul talked about the promise in Romans 15. He raised up unto Israel, not to the Jew, unto Israel, as Savior Jesus. And he goes all the way through that, how Jesus died on the cross. And then God raised him up in new life. And this was to be accepted as their Savior. And it was by grace, verse 39. Great verse, we don't always look at this. But it says, by him, by Jesus, all that believe. So he's preaching believing. All that believe are justified from all things from which you cannot be justified by the law of Moses. He would never say that to a Gentile. Well, Gentiles would have no idea. What are you talking about us about the law of Moses? What is that anyway? No, this is to Israel. And he's saying, you are not being saved by your keeping of the law and your own efforts in the flesh. Okay? You're not going to make it as physical Israel. As much as you try, as much as you do, you're not going to make it in God's eyes and never be blessed. If you're just going to keep doing it in your flesh and because of your blood and the covenant and all that, you're never going to make it. You must believe in this Jesus. The one that came unto his own. And you have not received him. But as many as received him, to them gave you power to become the sons of God. He says, that's who you need to believe. And you will be justified from all things. How? By believing. That's a powerful verse there. It's not by your works. We often quote, by grace you're saved through faith. This is just as good. We're justified by believing, by faith. Faith alone. And he really, he says beware in verse 4. He's going to give them a warning, boy, beware. I'm telling you the truth. If you do not receive him as your Savior, beware. Judgment's coming. And then look what we read in verse 42. And when, what did he address? Who did he address? Men of Israel. That's who he's talking to, men of Israel. What did it say in verse 42? And when the Jews. The men of Israel were the Jews. That's the same thing. And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And what happens the next Sabbath? They all come. The Gentiles accepted, the Jews rejected, and Paul says, I'm not preaching to you Jews anymore. I'm going to the Gentiles. Well, he says that, but he does go back to the Jews a few more times. What what's the point? Jesus came for his own. Jesus came first of all to Israel, to his people, to those that were thinking they're going to get saved by their covenant, by their birth, by their circumcision, just because they are born of Abraham. They are of the fathers. And Peter and Paul are saying, that's not the blessing. That's not what the whole blessing. The blessing is that you can have forgiveness of sins and be justified by faith. And you know what the blessing is for the Gentile? The same thing. The same thing. Show you now. We're going to close here. Look at the blessing to the Gentile. Romans chapter 15. Okay, let's go to Romans chapter 15, verse number 9. Now, there were promises. Look at verse 8, talks about the promises to the fathers. There was, yes, the promise of the land and the promise of multiplying and all that. That was going to happen later. That wasn't the best part. That wasn't what came first. The first that came was that Jesus would die for their sin and take away their iniquity, justify them from all things. That was the big blessing. And that's what's going to be the blessing for the Gentile, verse 9. And that the Gentile might glorify God for his mercy. If he didn't have mercy on the Gentile was definitely doomed to hell. I mean, they didn't even have the law. They had idols. They didn't even, they weren't even close. They were destined to hell, but God in his mercy says, I'll go to you too. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. Now we don't have time to go on how God, decided, well, we'll get the Gentile, but the Gentiles got it. Gentiles accepted it. And Paul would go to the Jew first, and oftentimes they would reject it. He'd go to the Gentile, and the Gentile would receive it. Do you know what God says? You might have received the salvation, but don't forget where it came from. Make sure you glorify God for it. Don't forget to thank him for it. Praise him. He talks about singing songs there in the next part. As it is written, for this cause I will confess thee among the Gentiles and sing unto thy name. I was mainly going to look at what was for Israel, but the Gentiles, they received mercy too. They received salvation by faith. They received justification by faith and faith alone without the works of the law too. They received mercy from God. And we need to glorify him. We need to honor him for that. God didn't have to go to us. He went, Jesus Christ came for his own. We're not his own. He came to save his people from their sin. We're not his people. But by his mercy, he says, I will offer it to the Gentiles also. I'll open it up to the Gentiles. They can receive it also. As many as receive him. As many as receive him. That's wonderful. I challenge you to thank the Lord for your salvation. Thank the Lord for his mercy. His mercies, it's not just in our standing and our walk. His mercies are new every morning. We can get into that. Glorify God with your body, which is his, and all those things. Glorify God, honor him with all your heart, because Jesus came first to physical Israel. Physical Israel, on the most part, rejected it. They said, we're just going to keep doing what we were doing. Get circumcised, try to keep the law, blah, 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 blah. And God says, okay, I'll offer to the Gentile. Offer to the Gentile. I'll offer them mercy. They'll take it. And if you're here saved this evening, you were given mercy. We need to thank Him for it, glorify God in His mercy, and look for His mercies, His new mercies every day. Let's remember that. Let's, remember, be glad, and yes, be thankful. Every day. There's a lot of things we can complain about and we're worried about. But Paul is saying, let's get back to what God did for us. In His mercy, He saved us. He justified us. He cleansed us from all sin. What a blessing. What a blessing. Don't worry about, you don't get the blessing of the land. You got a blessing in Christ, the abiding life of Christ. It's such a blessing. Just be thankful for it. Let's be thankful and glorify God for His mercy. That's a command. I'm going to leave that with you tonight. Glorify God for His mercy. That's what a Gentile is supposed to do. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for the word. Tonight I pray that it all sort of fit together. The puzzle was kind of put together, and we could see what the picture here, what Jesus came to do. He came for His own, and His own received Him not. And so you said, but as many as received Him, to them gave you power to become the sons of God. And that's how we got mercy. We became part of that. Any man, not his people, but the people that He wasn't even thinking about. We got Him on mercy. Let us be thankful. Let us glorify God in His mercy. Help us, Lord, to glorify God in the right way, with a full heart.